So we talked about the tipping points in the Earth system, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, Greenland ice sheets, Antarctic ice sheets, Arctic sea ice, monsoon, El Nino, Amazon forests, and so on and so forth. Now there are ideas about how to use critical junctures in the social dynamics to maybe intervene and accelerate the transitions, socio-technical transitions, to rapidly accomplish the global warming targets, let's say, safely, and also to get out of the carbon trap that we talked about, so that anything you buy will be automatically carbon neutral, carbon negative, environmentally friendly, and so on, so that you don't have to worry about replacing your car, replacing your phone, traveling, etc., which would be fantastic, right? So this paper looks at social tipping interventions that could trigger the tipping of social tipping element subsystems, which include removing fossil fuel subsidies and incentivizing decentralized energy generation, so energy production and storage systems. You can imagine that if storage systems became very efficient and effective and solar could be produced and wind, then obviously we would get away from fossil fuels and especially coal very quickly. Building carbon neutral cities, human settlements, divesting from assets linked to fossil fuels, so financial markets come in as social tipping elements, revealing the moral implications of fossil fuels, so norms and value systems which always get in the way. If you look at the response to COVID restrictions, vaccination mandates, and so on, you can see that the people's belief systems and religious beliefs or personal beliefs, whatever, are playing havoc with getting everybody vaccinated. And if you are not a believer in vaccination, then that's something that has to be also considered in such social tipping interventions. Strengthening climate education and engagement, so education system as a social tipping element, and disclosing information on greenhouse gas emissions, which is information feedbacks, which can complicate the transitions, especially how smooth the transitions will be. So this research reveals important areas of focus for larger scale empirical and modeling efforts to better understand the potentials of harnessing social tipping dynamics for climate change mitigation. So this is another way of looking at what we have looked at as the emissions gap. So here it is looking at a rate of change in emissions per year in percentage. So from 1930 we were below, so we increased the emissions towards zero, and then Second World War had a good impact in terms of emissions reductions. We bounced right back over the baseline here, and the industrial economy and then the digital economy kicked in along the way, and we have remained above, except for the social tipping elements like the collapse of communism, and there are small bumps as well along the way, like the financial crisis of 2008. So we have talked about the various RCPs and historical emissions, and I mentioned several times that we're already behind in terms of heading towards the drawdown of carbon or emissions reductions. And this schematically says that if you use the social tipping interventions, you can halve the global emissions by 2030 and reach net zero emissions by 2050, because when we look at emissions gap, we looked at current policy scenarios, future policies, nationally determined contributions, and so on, and said we are still not on track to accomplishing this. So to get in the Paris range, this argument here is that there are times where social interventions are possible. unintended consequences, equity, justice, and so on. Of course, ethics are all concerns, of course. So here, looking again in a phase space of level of decarbonization we want to accomplish versus the stability which increases down here, we are stuck here in the business as usual or the carbon trap, where small perturbations are going to bring us right back to the business as usual scenario, which is the worst of the emission scenarios, RCP 8.5. So this talks about social tipping interventions which can turn us down at some point, and then can really change course if we are forceful enough, and then bring us towards decarbonization and stability. And here the social complexities can obviously be low or high in terms of the interventions we talked about. So if it is low social complexity, then we may have smooth transition like this towards stability, or we may have bumps along the way with crashes and rises and so on before we reach these stable points we want. So the inherent social noise will complicate transformative change, but could also accelerate it by means of dynamical phenomena such as stochastic resonance, which are dynamic system jargon I don't want to talk about, but you can imagine that pandemic which becomes global is going to arouse all kinds of social noise, as I said, anti-vaccine movements, shaming, vaccine shaming, travel complications, trade complications, lockdowns, resistance to lockdowns, and so on and so forth. Okay, so uncertainties and complexities inherent in the many dimensions of human societies beyond their level of decarbonization can be envisioned as forming a rougher stability landscape here, featuring multiple attracting states and a larger number of barriers that need to be eroded to overcome. So we talked about the strange attractors. So the system does have multiple attracting states where the societal comfort zone, if you will, of living a high energy lifestyle and not worrying about the future of climate change, for example. Okay, so social tipping elements and associated social tipping interventions with potential to drive rapid decarbonization in the world Earth system. So we have the Earth system with its tipping points that we looked at. The processes they represent unfold across levels of social structure on widely different timescales, which we are looking at here, ranging from the fast dynamics of market exchanges and resource allocation on sub-annual timescales to the slow decadal to centennial scale changes on the level of customs, values, and social norms. So estimated time needed to trigger social tipping goes from very rapid, so less than a year, for financial market and information feedback, so greenhouse gas information disclosure, fossil fuel divestment, and so on, to 5 to 10 years where you have decentralized energy generation, carbon neutral cities, human settlements, energy production and storage systems, transitioning into 10 to 30 years for removal of fossil fuel subsidies, which are hardwired in and are going to be very difficult to remove. Education system, and there are feedbacks. So there are positive feedbacks. So if you have good education system, it may accelerate information disclosure and fossil fuel divestment, which is happening at universities. For example, private universities and public universities with large endowments are taking vows to divest from fossil fuels. Of course, there are unless there are alternatives, this can be kind of not a good feedback, in the sense, as we said before, the Stone Age didn't come to an end because they ran out of stones. So unless we have alternatives, fossil fuel divestment may not be necessarily very effective. And very slow time scale changes that include recognition of moral implications of fossil fuels, and education can have a positive feedback on it, and it can also feed back to removal of fossil fuel subsidies, energy reduction and production and storage, and so on, and human settlements. We also talked about wicked problem. So education always comes up as a wicked problem in terms of not having a simple silver bullet kind of solution, but having to be resolved at multiple levels, literally from parent-teacher association, school district levels to state levels, local, state, national levels, and so on. And you have world system of human societies and social structure layers in terms of stabilization, where you have direct and indirect feedbacks. So you have customs, norms, and religion feeding on to policies, regulations, and infrastructure, feeding on to technology and governance, and resource allocation and market exchange, which can drive indirect feedbacks to innovation. And of course, resource allocation and market exchange can also indirectly affect governance, technology, which can then affect policies, regulation, infrastructure, which can begin to modulate customs, norms, and religion as well, which is already happening in terms of debating whether we are meant to be stewards of the environment, or are we just supposed to exploit it and dominate it and let God worry about it, and so on. So stabilization increases in this direction and decreases in that direction. Okay, so quick introduction, of course, but the ideas are good, so you can read other related literature and this paper for further details on how the models used for doing some of these calculations, so-called integrated assessment models, affect the timescales and outcomes and stability estimates and role of tipping interventions, social tipping interventions, and so on. Okay.